Hey, Kristen, how's it tracking?
With Carvana Value Tracker.
What else?
Oh, it's tracking. In fact, Value Surge Alert trucks up 2.5%. Vans down 1.7%.
Just as predicted. So, we gonna...
I don't know. Could sell, could hold.
The power to always know our car's worth.
Exhilarating, isn't it?
Tracking.
Always know your car's worth with Carvana Value Tracker.
This is LBC with James O'Brien. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
It is 11:34. Just by way of an aside, the claim that the people who were being spared the higher tariffs, everybody, of course, yesterday coming down to the 10% figure, except China, which meant that Brexiters got 4 days to claim that there was a Brexit benefit in being on 10 when the European Union was on 20. The European Union came down to 10 yesterday, although you may not find that widely reported or loudly reported in the UK's client media. The press secretary, Caroline Levitt, was claiming that the countries that were being eased up on were the ones that hadn't retaliated. I think Trump said that, actually, not just her. Trump said he was only easing up on countries that hadn't retaliated, which must have come as a bit of a shock in Brussels, who, of course, agreed on Wednesday to hit US exports with retaliatory tariffs. So again, the idea that you can't trust a single syllable that comes out of his ridiculous gob is just there. Every minute, every story, every line of every story just contains proof that you can't trust this man as far as you would throw him. But he's an absolute genius. Claim the supporters still on side. That the EU is getting a reprieve, and the EU had retaliated. Point that out to the White House, and they'll say, oh yes, but they hadn't retaliated yet. They'd announced the retaliation, they'd announced the point at which the retaliation would kick in, but we hadn't actually reached that point, so therefore it wasn't actually a retaliation. Incredible, really. Simon Marks is here. He joins me now to do what, Simon? To how many times can we begin our conversations with the same sort of existential shrug, I think is the phrase I'm going to go with for the moment. But how does Donald Trump style his way out of this one?
Well, they've already started, haven't they, James? I mean, we saw Caroline Levitt and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, yesterday immediately going out to the microphones and insisting that this was always part of the plan. It all shows the genius of Trump, the art of the deal, Scott Bessent was talking about, referring back to Trump's famous book about how to run a business. But there is no coherence, and there is total confusion even now about precisely where all of this is going, because even though he's clearly done a U-turn and an absolutely major policy reverse that he was insisting even up to late on Sunday that he wasn't going to engage in, what happens in 90 days' time? What happens when this review that he says is now taking place is going to come to an end? He's offering the markets a short-term boost, but he's not offering business in the United States or around the world any kind of clarity. He's also sort of in an imperial fashion indicating that there may be some industries within the United States that he agrees to exempt even from the 90-day tariffs. So that's going to lead to the major titans of industry in the United States preening even more before him in order to attract his favour. But I think it's really important to underscore that he has ripped the guts out of the heart of his economic policy. This is a man who said tariffs was his favourite word in the English language. He announced last Wednesday Liberation Day in the United States. He characterised it as one of the most important days in American history. We went through that ludicrous dog and pony show at the White House, that sort of Eurovision Song Contest style presentation of these tariffs that he was applying here, there and everywhere, but not, of course, in the direction of Russia. He then refused to back down. He insisted on social media and in conversations with reporters that the operation was a success. The patient had survived, but the operation was completely elective. I mean, he's taken a strongly performing economy and driven it straight into a wall aided and abetted by those sycophants who surround him and who clearly have absolutely no capacity to protect him from his own worst impulses.
And that's largely, as you know, why they were selected, because anybody who was prepared, and there were some people in the first term who were prepared to point out the idiocy of some of his plans, or to stay his hand, or to, persuade him to take his foot off the accelerator. There's none now in the White House, none in the administration at all.
No, absolutely none. And I mean, the people that surround him that have got even more omelette on their faces today than he has, include characters that were discredited before this all began, including, his economic advisor, Peter Navarro, the apostle of the notion of putting tariffs in place on countries all over the world, and Howard Lutnick, his Commerce Secretary, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who was laughably last week arguing that the tariffs didn't have to be passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices because retailers in the United States could simply absorb the price increases, or maybe even the producers overseas could, as he put it, eat the tariffs. I mean, none of that was ever going to happen. But again, to underscore the centrality of this to Trump's economic policy, the president was musing again last Wednesday when he unveiled all of this about the prospect of this policy being so successful that, as in the 1880s and the 1890s, when, remember, America was a much smaller country and also a far less egalitarian country in terms of offering assistance and recognition to all of its people, he had this idea that, the United States in 2025 might find itself in a position where it was taking in so much money as a result of these tariffs. He was going to have to open a Department of External Revenue to collect all the cash, and he postulated that perhaps it would be possible to fund the government only out of tariff revenues and then scrap income tax. That's how big the dream was. Now, what is he left with? He's left with an insistence that there have to be tax cuts for the wealthy, that he's trying to steer through Congress, although the House of Representatives Republicans there want to see even bigger public spending cuts than were contained in the president's original budget proposal. But what happens beyond that? Okay, tax cuts for the super rich, and how does he now restore confidence in the United States as a stable place for investment, given the roller coaster that everybody has been on over the last week? It's going to be very, very difficult to magic all that away.
Often we find ourselves circling familiar territory, although if I'm running with one of your analogies, the medical one, the tumour gets bigger every time we point at it, because, as you've reminded us, that the sycophants and the cronies that surround him are now in the position of celebrating the fact that he told such massive lies. Under their analysis of this having been the plan all along, they're going, isn't it brilliant? His lies are so enormous. They're the biggest lies. They're the greatest lies. But of course they can't acknowledge that themselves. But that tumour is the same. And it occurs to me, listening to you, and using the markets as a measure or a reminder, that he operates like a market. He operates in a 24-hour cycle. So as soon as you said what happens in 90 days' time, my inner voice obviously said, well, who knows whether it'll be 90 days. You can't trust the word that comes out of his mouth. But what he did yesterday was all about yesterday. What he did yesterday was all about getting him over this self-constructed obstacle that had appeared in front of him. The bond market's getting spooked. China or Japan or hedge funds or all or some of the above, dumping US Treasury bonds, creating a Liz Truss-style scenario. Even he recognised that he had to do something. He won't tell the truth about what it is that he's done, but it was all and only about yesterday. He could do something completely different again tomorrow.
Yes, and it's interesting that you reference Liz Truss, because this is a Liz Truss style scenario. It's what happens in a Liz Truss scenario without a 1922 committee, without the capacity of Republicans in Congress to begin any kind of formal proceeding, short of impeachment, and they're never ever going to do that, to get rid of him. So they are stuck with him. And what we realized, I think, yesterday is that the only guardrails that are vaguely in place are senior Republican Republicans on Capitol Hill on this issue kind of finding their spine. I mean, it took them a while, and it was Ted Cruz of Texas over the weekend who really kind of led the pushback, saying, you know, I'm not opposed to tariffs if they're short term, but if this is going to be, you know, the long-term governing policy for the economy, that's going to be a problem. So that then provided the leverage for Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, to make this emergency trip to Mar-a-Lago over the weekend and say to the president, we're sailing into a heap of trouble here. You need to offer negotiations, because there hadn't even been the suggestion up until then that Trump was open to the idea of negotiations with the people who were on the receiving end of reciprocal tariffs that, of course, were not reciprocal tariffs in the first place. So the only guardrails that exist are Republicans in Congress locating a backbone and the captains of the tech industry and all the other major titans of commerce who have bent the knee before Trump, who were looking at their own bank balances and saying, what the hell is going on here? You've got to change course. Yeah.
And finally, Simon Marks, I mean, returning again to the theme of familiar territory, but getting bigger and getting uglier. Even the most cursory understanding of what has gone on points to epic contradictions. So if it was designed, as he has claimed, to create a queue of countries waiting to, and forgive my language, but I'm quoting the President of the United States of America, kiss his ass, end quotes, then negotiations would see a reduction in the tariffs. And yet at the same time, the rationale for the tariffs is the necessity of raising huge amounts of money so that he could then abolish or massively reduce income tax. They cannot both happen. They cannot both be simultaneously true. Correct. It's a negotiating tactic that will make importers change their views. You know, they will make people importing from the United States of America charge less for the privilege. But at the same time, it's going to raise so much money that we can abolish tax. I mean, that's the upside down. That's Neverland.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was asked this at the White House on Tuesday by a reporter who said, so hang on a second, are you up for negotiations to get rid of these tariffs, or is this the operating principle? And his answer to the question was basically, it can be both. Well, it can't possibly be both, because if your operating principle is that you want to bring in so much money through tariffs that you want to get rid of income tax, that's doubling down and being committed to trade barriers and a trade war. Negotiations are designed to alleviate that, but then would reduce the amount of money that you were bringing in due to tariffs. I think it's also just briefly, James, making the point that before Donald Trump U-turned yesterday, he put a message out on his social media saying, this is a great time to buy, and he signed it DJT, which are, of course, his initials, Donald J. Trump. But they are also the three-letter stock index abbreviation for his own company. And there are lots of people out there that appear to have read that message as, this is a great time to buy DJT. In other words, shares in his own company. And the notion that the President of the United States has not divested himself in any meaningful way from his businesses, and over the last week has engaged in the most apparently erratic market moves that any president has ever engaged in since the 1930s, and yet on the flip side of it, also has the capacity personally to benefit from his own major market moves, in any normal democracy would immediately spark an investigation.
You know, I find myself thinking of Jimmy Carter's peanut farm surprisingly often at the moment, Simon.
If
and
only
the blind trust, of course, if only, yes, and the blind trust into which he put it for fear of being perceived, let alone accused, of doing anything in the White House that might affect his own commercial interests. DJT. Perhaps, thank you, Simon Marks, LBC's US editor, perhaps DJT stands for Donald J. Truss. I don't know. It's 11:47.